inviting us to this wonderful workshop, which I learned this morning that it turns out to be very, very important issue, especially for North African region. Just to give you a sort of highlight about what I'm going to speak in the next few minutes, basically I'm going to talk only three things. One is just to give you an idea what's going on in Asia, what happened in Asia with respect to the regional integration. So that's the first one that I want to share with you. And then the second part, I would like to sort of speculate or make a prognosis. What will happen in the next few years with regards to the regional integration in Asia? And then the last one, hopefully something that can be shared by most of you, and that is the lessons that I believe can be learned from both the success as well as the mistake of Asia in doing the regional integration. So let me begin with the first one. If someone would like to explain about how is the progress of regional integration, there are many ways that you can explain. For Asia, I personally think the best way to explain is what's going on in the global economy. Now, one of the most important features with the global economy, especially after the collapse of the Lehman Brothers during the fall 2008, and then with the Eurozone crisis, what we observe in the global economy is a pattern which is called the double-track growth. Why this is called double-track growth? Because we are talking about the growth of industrial countries that are slowing down, and I'm talking about the growth in the US as well as in the Europe, whereas the growth on the emerging economies, especially emerging Asia, has been doing relatively strong. So what you see is really a pattern something like this. So the red one is the growth of the emerging Asia, and then the blue one is the growth of the industrial countries. Now, the question is, how could this happen? Well, this is not a forum to discuss about the European or the US economy. So what I would like to explain is what happened with the red one, what happened with the trend of the growth in the emerging Asia, why emerging Asia is doing quite well. One of the immediate impact of the global financial crisis is really the drop and the fall in the world trade. Now, when we talk about international trade, Asia is perhaps one of the most trade-dependent economies. Many countries in Asia depend so much on export, for example. Their share of export in the GDP can be as high as more than 100%, for example, in the case of Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so forth. So it's highly dependent. So it doesn't need to be rocket scientists to expect when the world trade drop, when the demand from the US, the demand from Europe drop, these countries were badly hit. And that's what's happening in these countries. So it becomes a question mark. If they were badly hit, how could they maintain this relatively strong growth? Here is the answer, and that is the theme of today. The answer is because trade integration increased dramatically during the period after the global financial crisis. And I'm going to show you in a second something that is dramatic. Even colleagues sitting on the back can see it very clearly. And this is the pattern like this. You can see the share of Asia trade with G2, that is the US and Europe, drop. And the trend started since 1997, since the Asian financial crisis, actually. But you can see it accelerated after the global financial crisis. So since 1997, you see that the blue line started to fall, whereas the green line started to increase. The green line, that's the regional integration in Asia. That's the trade integration. That reflects the trade among Asian countries, the intra-Asian trade. Now, one would question why the increase of the intra-Asian trade was quite significant, despite the fact the global economy was really in the doldrum. Is it really only the demand from Asia, within Asia? The answer is no. The increase of export from Asia is not only to another Asian countries, but also to other emerging market economies outside Asia, including Africa. In fact, the share of Asian trade to Africa doubled in the last 10 years. It's still small, but it increased double. So colleagues in Asian Development Bank call this South-South trade. Definitely the share of the South-South trade has increased. So that's the first question. The second question is that, what is the implication of all this for Asia? And this is what makes me busy traveling towards, Asian Development Bank has 48 member countries. So I've been busy traveling, talking with policymakers in the region, because this is what most of us call the new normal. The reason why it's called new normal, because for the last couple of decades, the patterns of trade in Asia is the following. Very simple. Other Asian countries export intermediate goods to certain country in Asia, and that certain country is China. So I'm going to give only one example. Now, of course, one example doesn't explain everything, but at least it gives you an idea what is the trend in trade pattern in Asia. So let's say ASEAN countries, the associations of Southeast Asian nations, 10 countries, they are exporting intermediate goods to China. And then China, being the factory of the world, they produce the final goods. Where do the China export to? To G2, the traditional market, Europe and the US. Now, as I said, and you know very well, that the US and Europe is in trouble. Their demand has dropped. As a result, the question is, what is the implications of all this trend that I'm showing you here on the development policy, on the trade policy within the region? This is the big question mark, and this is, I would say, one of the most important policy issues in Asia at this moment. One can ask also another question. Is this trend cyclical or structural? Maybe this is only happening for the next 2-3 years, or it is going to last long. Now, during our annual meeting last May, we conducted this annual meeting seminar, which we call the Governor Seminar. And we invited speakers from Europe, from the US, and so forth. The conclusion that we learned from our colleagues from the US and the US, this is going to last long. So in other words, it's not going to last for 2-3 years, maybe 10-15 years. And that gives a lot of homework to the policymaker in Asia. The reason is because if you used to export your final products to industrial countries, and now you are quote-unquote forced to sell your final products to other Asian countries, there's a lot of implications in terms of technology that you're using, in terms of labor absorption, employment, in terms of factor proportions, capital labor ratio, financing, and so forth. So there's so many policy implications of this trend. So that's, I think, about the trade side. Now let me move to the financial side. I heard this morning that in North Africa, the degree of integration in the financial sector is very low. The same thing with Asia, except the figure is a bit higher in Asia. Let's start with the equity market, the stock market. If we measure the cross-border holding of the equity market within Asia, 10 years ago, it was about 19%. Now it's about 27%, 10 years later. So there was an increase. But if you look at the bonds market, the debt market, 10 years ago it was 5%, and then now it's about 8%. So increase only slightly. Now, when we look at this trend, you cannot help to ask your question, is this going to continue, or this is going to be just temporary trend? So similar questions for the trade apply to the financial sector. And this is one of the other tasks of the office that I'm heading. The office is named Office of Regional Economic Integration. Again, what we did is talk to the policymakers in the region. And here is what we learned. Policymakers in the regions are so keen to facilitate this trend of increased integration in financial sector. I'll give you one example. In the bonds market, among 13 countries in Asia, it's called the ASEAN plus 3. So 10 ASEAN plus Korea, Japan, and China. 13, ASEAN plus 3. They launched a program which is called the Asian Bond Market Initiative. The background why they launched this ABMI is 15 years ago, during the Asian financial crisis, one of the most important determinants of the Asian financial crisis is what we call the double mismatch. That is the mismatch in the currency, because you borrow foreign currency and then you lend in local currency. And the second is maturity mismatch. You borrow short-term and then you lend long-term. So we don't want to repeat that. And the answer to sort of efforts to avoid another double mismatch is to develop regional bonds market. Why? Because bonds is long-term, so you remove the maturity mismatch, and the bonds is in local currency. So you remove the currency mismatch. So that is one example what the regional government policymakers are trying to do in the financial market. Now, if we put all this together, and then I were to predict what will be the trend, and this is my second point, trying to make prognosis, trying to speculate what will happen with the Asian integration in the next 10, 15 years, I will not have a second thought. It will increase further. That means Asian economy will be far more integrated 10 years from now than now. So if you look at this trend, the increase of the integration has been already significant, but what I'm arguing now, it will continue to increase further, at least in the next 10 years. That's basically the prognosis that I'm making. Now, let me move to the last point, and that is, what's the lessons that we learned? Because so far, I'm only giving you the facts. So I'm not really giving you what is the background, what are the problems behind all this. Well, let's start with trade. At the same time with the trend of the trade, the number of the FTA, free trade arrangement in Asia, has increased tremendously. By now, it's more than 120 FTAs, either prepared or signed already in Asia. So when you have two facts together, one is increased FTA, and fact number two, the intra-Asian trade increase, you would have thought that, thank God, there is an FTA, and that FTA helped increase the intra-Asian trade, so that when the world trade collapses, Asia can continue the double-track growth, because they can trade with other Asian countries as well as other emerging markets. Unfortunately, the answer is no. Yes, the number of the free trade arrangement has proliferated like this. But let me share with you, the utilization of this FTA is very small. In average, it's about 20%. Of course, it varies. Some countries like Singapore, the utilization of the FTA is as high as 40%, but other countries can be as low as 5%. So if there is one lesson based on the experience of the Asian trade integration, is that FTA is good, but it has to be followed by concrete measure. In other words, the success of the Asia production network, the success of the Asian intra-trade, and the success of the supply chain that we keep hearing about Asia, it's very little to do with the FTAs. This is the stage now where the policymakers in the region trying to make the utilization of the FTA higher. So maybe the first lesson is that don't just sign an FTA, but follow it up with a concrete measure. Because at the end of the day, it's really the business sectors. At the end of the day, it's really the agent, the players, not the government, not the policymakers, and so forth. And we are very strongly recommending the policymakers in Asia to do more sort of proactive kind of sharing the information about FTA. Because we found it very strange. You know, in preparing just one FTA, it can take as long as 2 years. Not to mention how many resources that they have to spend, not only financial resources, but time, energy, and so forth. And then after 2 years, they sign the FTA. And yet, the reality, it's used only for 20%. So this is very serious matter that we are now recommending policymakers in Asia. So that's in the area of trade. What happened in the area of the finance? You know, just last week, we launched a new publication on the Asian bond market. The story is the following. Too many Asian policymakers always argue that despite the global financial crisis, despite the Eurozone crisis, our financial sector has been resilient. They are right. Actually, since the Asian financial crisis in 1997, there's a lot of improvement. The banking sector has been getting stronger, the bonds market developed, stock market developed, and so forth. So yes, the financial sector in the region is getting more resilient. But we are also telling the policymakers, be careful, because financial market is completely different animal than the goods market. There's a lot of asymmetric information, there's a lot of sentiment, there's a lot of something beyond economic fundamentals. And Asia, of all the regions in the world, learned the very hard lesson in 1997. If you recall what happened in 1997, everybody was shocked with the crisis. Why? Because in 1996, if you look at the fundamentals of all these Asian countries, they were strong, but yet they're hit by the financial crisis. So our message to policymakers in Asia is that don't be complacent, because financial sector is a very dangerous sector. So what is the lesson here as far as the financial sector is concerned? Unlike in trade integration, just be careful when you try to increase the integration in financial sector. Because yes, there are positive effects of the financial integration, but there are also negative effects. There's a risk. And the risk I'm talking here is the risk of contagion, especially contagions from one member of your region. If they are in trouble, it can spread out very quickly and very unexpectedly. And this is the message that we sent in our publication last week. That's the second lesson. What is the third lesson? Overall, applies to both trade as well as financial sector. The third lesson is, at the end of the day, is really the unilateral policies that matters. So regional cooperation, and I'm so happy to hear this morning's session, someone mentioned that regional integration and regional cooperation should not be a substitute to the good, prudent national policies. So that's the biggest lesson. And let me say a few words about this. Some of you may still recall, before the Asian financial crisis in 1990s, there was one famous book. At that time, it was famous. Maybe by now it's no longer famous, it became infamous. And the book was published by the World Bank. The title is East Asian Miracle. One of the main messages of that book is that the success of the Asia is not because of cooperation, not because of integration, but because of unilateral liberalization policies. So now we are telling policymakers in the region, continue doing that. However, given the new normal that I was sharing with you, global economy change, the multipolar world and so forth, then this is also the time to try to cooperate more among member countries so that increased integration supported by strong unilateral policies should be pursued. The next lesson that we think is very important is regional cooperation. The reason is because we believe so much that regional integration carry positive effect, but at the same time it also carry risk. You know, several speakers already discussed this morning. I added the risk of contagion. There's a risk of trade diversion. There is a risk of increased inequality. Let me say a few seconds about this. You know, Asia has been doing very well. I was sharing with you. But there's something that I'm not showing you, showing Asia is doing very badly, and that is on the social issues. Income inequality in all Asian countries, no exception, has been worsening. Okay? So my point here is that if integration is going to increase in the coming years, it should be followed or it should be accompanied by strong regional cooperation. And I can give you one concrete example in the area of finance. As I mentioned a few seconds ago, financial sector is very different animal. It can easily create contagion. So each country should strengthen their domestic financial safety net. They increase or strengthen the foreign reserve, they increase or strengthen the banking sector and so forth. So those are examples of a domestic financial safety net. But we are arguing that's not enough, because the forces of the contagion coming from the financial sector can be so strong and can be unexpected. So we are recommending to strengthen the regional financial safety net. And this is what's going on in ASEAN Plus 3. We have what we call the CMIM, Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralized. Basically, this is almost like the Asian Monetary Fund. So if one of the Asian member countries are in crisis, in the past, they have to call 911. They have to call the IMF, basically. But now, they have an option. They can call the regional office, which is called the CMIM. This is what we call the regional financial safety net. So I think there are a couple of lessons that one can learn from the experience, both the good as well as the failures of the regional cooperation and integration in Asia. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Aziz, for this presentation on Asian experience on regional integration. والآن أعطي الكلمة للسيد أنطونيو استيفادورا مدير الاندماج والتجارة بمصرف البلدان الأمريكية للتنمية. Mr. أنطونيو. منى.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank the African Development Bank and the presidency of the Tunisian government for this invitation. I think I'm going to do a little bit similar to what Mr. Aziz has done, is try to share with you in about 15 minutes a little bit the experience of how the regional integration has taken place in our region, in Latin America and in the Caribbean. This is a story of more than 50 years, so it's going to be a little bit difficult to encapsulate it in just 15 minutes. But I'll try to do that. Just to give you the punchline again, as Mr. Aziz has done in terms of what I want to present, I think there are two things that you should keep in mind when embarking in one of these regional integration processes based on a block concept, a few countries trying to integrate themselves. First, and this is the experience in our region, be prepared for a very dynamic, a very complicated process. What you started today, it may be very different of what you end up doing or trying to do in the next 10 years. And this I'll show you in some examples in the regions. So this is not something that you start from zero and you get into zero. It's a very complex, very dynamic process. In our case, the regional integration blocks or processes in the 1970s is not the same in the 90s, and is not the same what we have today. So almost every 10, 15 years, the process suffered major shocks, has to adapt to a new international context, and it changes. So be prepared for these changes. And the second, and I think this has been a point that was made also this morning, and again, in the Asian context, be prepared to use this an instrument, not in itself. This should be a platform, an instrument for integration into the global economy. And also, I think it was said in the morning also, with your own continent, with your own hemisphere. It's integration not only with your neighbors, it's a platform for integration beyond your immediate neighbors, beyond the continent. And I'll tell you a little bit of the story in our region. What I'll do is just to start a few facts on what are the issues what has been the issues in terms of integration in our region, a quick diagnostics on where we come from and where we are going in the region in this process. And to do that, first, let me just give you a little bit of a sense on where we are as a region, and these are very interesting numbers to compare on your own region. Latin America and the Caribbean, and this is, I think, an important difference from Asia, is still a region with two very important gaps. We are not yet fully globally integrated into the world. This left graph shows very interestingly the weight the percentage of trade in Latin America vis-a-vis world trade. This is a percentage that has almost not increased in the last 30, 40 years. Our trade represents only around less than 10% of world trade. This is extremely small and has not increased. This is, of course, compared with the amazing changes in the trade weights of Asia that goes from around 5% in the 1970s to more than 25% today. So there's a big gap in our region in terms of the level of global integration. This is, of course, in average. And also at the levels of intra-regional trade. These numbers have already been repeated. The more integrated region in the world among neighbors is, of course, the European Union. Around 60% of total trade is among their own neighbors. This number is around 40% for Asia. In Latin America, we are lower than 20%. So only 20% of our trade is among our own borders. Just a quick facts. I'm not going to go, I'll share with you the presentation and you can look at this later on if you want the details. I'm going to concentrate only in one, at the top one. And this basically summarizes what we think are the main drivers that is basically moving or pushing this agenda in our region. I'll talk a little bit about the first one because I think it's the most interesting for this forum, which is this, what I was referring at the beginning, this emerging integration architecture that is extremely complex in our region. It has changes over the last 15, 20 years dramatically. And we have to deal with that, and that's something that may be also down the road in your own region. And then there are four factors that I think we have to take into account that are the ones that are today the more important factors for what is coming in the next year. First, it was repeated also this morning, is the logic of the private sector vis-a-vis an integration process that was in the past mostly driven by the state, by the government. And I think we will talk during the rest of the day about this concept, the fact that the way that we produce goods, the way that we produce services is completely fragmented around the world, so integration has to respond to this new reality. For Latin America, one factor that is completely changing the way that we think about integration has been the appearance in the last 10 years of a new big market, for some countries, a big competitor, which is Asia. Our trade with Asia has dramatically changed in the last 10 years, especially with China, and this has an impact in the way we see ourselves integrating with the neighbors. And two more points. One, I think, was also mentioned, and I think we will talk about this later on, the relevance of more and more non-traditional costs for us in the region have been successful in eliminating the traditional cost to integration, tariff barriers, some NTBs. Today, the costs for us are the logistical costs, the transportation issues. This is the really one who bites the most of the commercial transactions. And a point on regional asymmetries, which is also important. Let me just spend a few minutes on something that looks very complicated in the screen. But I think it summarizes very well what has been the structure, the architecture of integration in our region in the last 20 years. In the 1990s, we had a very simple structure with 4 regional blocks, similar to the blocks that you are trying to create here, in every single region, in the Caribbean, in Central America, in Mercosur, and in the Andean community. There were non-overlapping groups. There are 4 different groups, very similar in concept of the type of blocks that you are thinking in this region. Those are blocks that came from, some of them, not all of them, from the 60s and the 70s. And this was the traditional way of looking at integration, regional blocks, non-overlapping blocks. This changes dramatically in the mid-90s, around 1994. And there are 3 things that changes completely this architecture. One is and I'm sure that Gerardo will talk about this, is the signature of Nafta. Nafta was a big change of doing business in the region. It's the first time that one southern country, Mexico, engages in a free trade agreement with Canada and the US and looks at a completely different way of doing integration. Signing a very modern FTA, north-south type of agreement. The second thing that happened in '94 is Mercosur tries to push seriously a customs union, and we will talk a little bit more maybe later on, and I think it was mentioned here. To make the decision about forming a customs union is the most important decision that you could make. It's a very critical decision. If you do that, you just generate a different path of integration than if you don't do that. Maybe we can discuss this later on. Mercosur take this decision and in a way gives a signal that this is a way that we could keep doing integration, deepening our blocks, moving from customs unions maybe to macroeconomic coordination, maybe monetary union, kind of the European model of integration. And the last thing that happened in 1994, which was very important, is an attempt to have a regional integration agreement at the hemispheric level, including the United States and Canada. This was a process, what was called the FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas. This was an attempt to put everybody on the table under a single agreement. So you had, around mid-90s, three competing models. Let's keep pushing integration based on the traditional model, kind of the Mercosur Customs Union model, blocks. Let's keep doing this block type of integration. Nafta model opened up a completely different way of doing business. Let's sign FTAs with the partners that we are interested in, and let's keep moving integration in a much more pragmatic, much more faster way. Or let's attempt a continent-wide type of integration, which was the FTAA. Of these three models, what we call this menu of integration that we had in the mid-90s, the really one that took over was the Nafta model, and this is what you have in this slide here. This is the spread of FTAs all over the place. This is what the economists call the spaghetti ball in Latin America, or the noodle ball in Asia. Everybody signing agreements with the best partner that you have, and you create this complicated web of agreements that are overlapping on the top of the traditional blocks. So this is a way of ensuring some compatibility between what do you do at the bilateral level and at the block level. This process has continued, and we have now today, and this is a very complicated picture, all these cross-cutting FTAs in our region, in Asia, and in the Pacific. More and more, our own countries are signing agreements with Asia at the bilateral level. What happened with the traditional blocks? Some have survived. Mercosur is having their own different problems. Some have completely disappeared. The Andean community is today a bloc that practically has not, it doesn't exist. Just quick two lessons about this complicated process. One is that the good news about doing business that way is that we liberalize our own trade very fast. It's very easy to liberalize tariffs at the bilateral level. It's much more difficult to do it in a big group of countries. So when you look at the pictures, I will not show you because I don't have time. We have, by 2015, 85 or 90% almost of our intra-regional trade will be free of tariffs. So we have done this very, very quickly because we have done it at the bilateral level. The cost of doing it this way is that you create, this is a technical issue, a lot of different overlapping rules because all these agreements have their own rules, especially rules of origin that are different across agreements. So the cost of doing business is much, much higher for the private sector. A Chilean exporter, depending on which market they have their own FTA, they have to comply with different rules to penetrate those markets, and this is a cost for the business. What's happening now in the region, and this I think it's very important for this forum, is that because of this spaghetti ball, this complex number of rules, some groups of countries are rediscovering new blockings, and today probably the most interesting initiative in the region is an initiative called the Pacific Alliance that is a group formed by Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia. Mexico has never been part of any bloc. Chile is associated with the Mercosur bloc, and Peru and Colombia were members of the Andean community, which, as I said, is practically disappeared. These four countries are trying to create a new integration bloc, trying to harmonize some of the rules that were created by this spaghetti. So this bloc is emerging out of this process of doing business in the region. And this is basically what I meant by when you start the process, when we started the process 15 years ago here, we end up here. It's a very complicated, challenging process. I think I'm a little bit out of time. I'm going to move quickly to last just a couple of slides, just 2 more minutes. What's the agenda for the region, and in our case from the IDB, how we are supporting this integration agenda? Here we call 2 technical terms that are very used in this literature, which is to support the software type of policies. At the regional level, countries should try to promote collective policies to harmonize the regulatory systems at the regional level. This is the soft type of integration. But more importantly, we have to accompany this with what we call the hardware type of interventions, which is the investments in regional infrastructure. It doesn't mean much that we have wonderful trade agreements between our own countries if we don't have the routes, if we don't have the transportations that connect those countries to facilitate and to move the goods. So you have to focus on those. The examples of this, I think you all know. When we talk about software interventions, we mean institutions to promote trade, to promote investments, to ensure the conversions or the harmonizations of our own trade agreements. Everything that has to do with trade facilitation, trade logistics, we will talk probably about this a little bit in other panels. And on the hardware side, this is basically the interlinks through transportations, through telecommunications, or even energy types of corridors when this is an issue in a particular regions. One important element here that I want you to stress, and especially if you embark in this type of things, is the relative importance of those interventions. Sometimes one thing that constructions of roads, constructions of energy corridors is much more important. It's the real thing. But we're running some analysis in the bank, trying to see what would be the impact on trade for our own region if we do the 2 things. If we do the software types of policies, and we also put in place the type of investment infrastructure. And the returns of those investments are almost the same. And here the intuition is again the same thing I was telling you before. You can build wonderful roads between 2 countries, but if the customs doesn't work, if the trade facilitation procedures are not harmonized, you will have these huge lines of trucks waiting at the border. So you have to do both things. You can have actually the same, I mean, you can have wonderful customs, but if you don't have the roads, you will not have the trade. So the returns of these 2 interventions are very similar, and they will only be realized if you do it together. They are complementary. You cannot do one without the other. So the concept of bringing together these 2 policies when you think about regional integrations are very important. And I'm going to try to finish here, not to take more time, with just a list of things that I'm sure that will be part of the conversation the rest of the day. To invest in integration is a valuable proposition. This is what we learn from our own region. But there are also, we have to realize that there are not choices or false choices. Regional integration should be a complement to global integration. And I'm not going to elaborate here, but I'm just going to list these things. The software part is as important and is complementary to the hardware part of integration. You focus on customs, but you focus also on roads. Third, it has been said very clearly, the regional integration is not a substitute. It actually needs the type of domestic institutional and policy reforms at the national level. You cannot do one without the other. This was also raised here this morning at the beginning. You have to keep a balance between the political ambitions of these processes. Sometimes the political declarations go beyond what we can do in the short term with pragmatic goals. You have to do things that are visible in the short term to make it credible, so that the private sector finds specific benefits in the short term. We have talked about institutions. You have to have some mechanisms. I talk here about commitment technology. You have to make some, not necessarily big institutions, but some instruments to make real commitments among countries, to create incentives for moving ahead the agenda that has been agreed. And this has to be accompanied by financial instruments. Without financial support, in our own bank, we are devoting around 15% of our own resources for lending towards integration. So there has to be somehow financial support for this type of processes. I talk a little bit about the government versus the private sector. We cannot leave the private sector out of the picture. It's one of the most important partners and, into this process. This was not the case, for example, in our own region in the 70s. The integration was mostly a top-down approach. This is completely changing now in the most recent emerging initiatives. And the last point that was very emphasized by my colleague from the EDB, you cannot separate the economics from the other types of cooperation. If you separate both, you will not succeed. The pure economic aspects of integration requires other cooperation in any other, depending on your own interests. We talk about here about food security, we talk environment issues, we talk about energy. You have to put this into the picture if you want to make these processes successful. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Antonio, for this presentation and the experience of Latin America in integration, regional integration. والآن أعطي الكلمة للسيد جيراردو إسكيفال، أستاذ جامعي بالكوليجيو بالمكسيك.
Well, first of all, let me thank the organizers of this very interesting conference for having me here, for having invited me. I think it's a great opportunity for me to tell you a little bit about the experience of Mexico with NAFTA. As I was listening to the discussion this morning, it reminded me a lot of the discussion that took place in Mexico before getting into NAFTA 20 years ago. It was exactly the same kind of discussion in terms of whether Mexico should integrate more with the neighbors that we had, particularly to the south, in this case with the rest of Latin America, on the grounds that they were not only our neighbors, we share also the same language, we had the same roots, historical roots, and so on. And instead of getting integrated with the rest of Latin America, what happened is that we ended up getting integrated more with the United States. And as I will discuss right now, it was, I think, in the end, it was the right decision. It made more sense for what I'm going to talk a little bit in this presentation. And it was the more natural thing to do. Probably wasn't the best, it wasn't done in the best way, but it was probably the more natural thing to do, as I will explain in a second. So I will talk about the lessons, I think, that we can derive from the Mexican experience with NAFTA. But let me tell you a little bit about the context, because that's important. Actually, it's very important, the context, because when we opened up to trade in 1985 for the first time, Mexico was a very closed economy. And we opened up to trade not because we wanted to, because we had to. If you remember, we had, there was an oil crisis in 1985, the price of oil collapsed, and 80%, by then, 80% of total Mexican exports were comprised of oil, basically. So when the price of oil collapsed, we actually ended up with no foreign reserves, basically, at least not from this, the exports of this good. So we had to open up to trade, and Mexico unilaterally opened its trade in the mid-1980s. And since then, Mexico went into this process of opening up with the rest of the world, and particularly with opening up to trade with the United States. So Mexico, and the important thing is that Mexico and the USA are, which is called supernatural trade partners. That means that we are not just neighbors, we share a very large border to these two countries. Both are very large economies. We have complementary labor force structures in terms of demographics. That's also very important. We also have this problem in terms of migration, as you might know. There are millions of Mexicans living in the United States. There are years in which more than 1 million Mexicans cross illegally to the United States in the early 2000s. And there are very important asymmetries. Mexico is relatively poor compared to North America, and that was also very important, and that's why it also changed the way in which these free trade agreements were perceived. And but as I said, Mexico and the US are supernatural trade partners in the sense also that even before NAFTA, more than 80% of our exports went to the United States. That's because it was the largest source of demand of Mexican goods, and more than 70% of our imports came from the United States as well. So it was a very strong integration even before NAFTA. So now it's important also to understand what were the ideas behind NAFTA, because it's also related to what is being discussed here. In 1993, President Salinas, which is the president that actually implemented NAFTA, gave a speech at MIT, and he said a very famous expression, which is, we want to export goods, not people. And the point that he was trying to make is that precisely he was trying to reduce migration, because migration is also a very important source of problems with the United States. And because of, as I said, of the demographic transition in which we were, there was an important push in the labor market. There was millions of Mexicans trying to enter at that moment. More than 1.2 million of Mexicans entered into the labor force that year, in those years, per year, and that's why he was concerned with that. And also migration problems with the United States were increasing. So he was trying to say, and the point he was trying to make is that by opening up to trade and by signing the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, we could create jobs in Mexico. That was his idea. That was the idea behind that. And he also thought that by increasing trade, we could increase our living standards in Mexico. Now, let me talk a little bit about the expectations and reality. Those was the ideas behind NAFTA. The expectations, if you see the discussion that was going on in Mexico, both in Mexico and the United States, there were all sorts of expectations. People concerned, a lot of people very pessimistic about that, concerned with loss of jobs and firms and whole industries involved in Mexico and the United States, which didn't make sense. I mean, but also there was people concerned with the creation of jobs and the reallocation of jobs from the United States to Mexico, for example. So there was a lot of concerns on both sides of the border. In the end, basically none of them, well, this is on the one hand, pessimistic, but there were also an important number of people very optimistic about that. President Salinas, among other people. President Salinas said at some point that by signing up NAFTA, we were going to become like a first world country. We were going to get, and people thought in Mexico somehow that we could start earning as much as Americans do, for example. Just for your information, Mexico's per capita income is like 1/3 of the United States when you adjust by purchasing power parity. So some people thought that we were going to become like the United States. So people was really expectant about that, was really happy about the possibility of becoming more like the United States. So was optimistic and pessimistic people. In general, if you see what happened, actually, none of that happened. I mean, if you see at the real wages in Mexico, for example, these real wages, this NAFTA, there was a contraction at the beginning, and then it's very steady after that. So there's no big increases in terms of wages, real wages in Mexico. If you see per capita income in Mexico relative to that in the United States, which is this graph, it's after NAFTA, you see it's pretty flat. It's still about 30%, depending on the measure you want to use. So there was no really convergence between Mexico and the United States. But for example, also people in Mexico was concerned with the fact that US firms are much more productive than Mexicans and that they were going to be dismantled basically. Well, that didn't happen either. You see Mexico now has a large surplus with the United States, which is the blue line over here. Mexico now has like a 100 billion surplus per year with the United States, in their trade with the United States, which is a really amazing figure. If you think that before NAFTA, as you can see there, Mexico had a small deficit with the United States. So we moved from a small deficit to a very large surplus. So the first lesson then is beware of extreme forecasters. I mean, those people who say free trade is going to be the solution of all your problems, that's of course not true. But also beware of pessimistic people. I mean, in the end, there are both winners and losers in these cases, and all these extreme forecasts usually do not make that much sense. At least that was the case in Mexico. If you see what happened in terms of trade and investment between Mexico and the United States, you will see that there was a huge boom post-NAFTA in both trade and investment. that has increased substantially. If you ask proponents of NAFTA, they will say that there was a huge success. Well, that's true, but now that has started to fade out because of the entrance of China, for example, into the WTO, and because other countries reacted to what Mexico did. So, so this is the second lesson. I'm not going to spend that much time in this, but the second lesson, and also there was a huge increase in jobs at some point in Mexico, but that started also to slow down at some point. So in some sense, yes, NAFTA has been a huge success in terms of trade and investment flows, but the second lesson is that benefits from free trade agreements are not necessarily permanent, because there are also some other reactions by other players in the world. So these benefits might erode or fade out at some point. Third comment is that if you see what happened as I mentioned before, that Mexico was a very oil-dependent economy at some point in the 1980s, and that's why we needed to open up to trade at that point when the price of oil collapsed. Well, something that did happen as a result of the opening up to trade for Mexico, and this is something that was being discussed a little bit this morning, is that Mexico really changed the structure of the economy. I mean, the Mexican economy was forced to compete with the United States. There was a lot of investment in the manufacturing industry and so on. And now, from, as I said, 10, 20% of exports that were from manufacturing goods, now manufacturing goods is like 90% of Mexican exports, which means, which is good in the sense that makes us less vulnerable to a change in a price of a single good, which is what happened in the 1980s to Mexico, and also a little bit that happened also in 1994. But in general, this change in the structure was good, and that helped to change the structure of the economy. And if you want to make an economy less vulnerable to those small changes in the price of commodities, for example, opening up to trade might help you to transform the economy in that direction. This is lesson 3. Lesson 4 is that not everyone benefits equally from the opening to trade, which is something I already mentioned. In the case of Mexico, at least, if you see the relative wages in Mexico between skilled workers and unskilled workers, you see that after opening up to trade, there's a different trend, basically, which is there. Before entering into GATT, into the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, we had the ratio of skilled workers, the wage of skilled workers relative to unskilled workers was just two times. That increased substantially in those years until 3.5. So it was a very important increase in the wage inequality between skilled workers and unskilled workers. After getting into NAFTA, that started to revert a little bit, which is a good thing for unskilled workers and for reducing inequality in Mexico. But at the beginning of the opening up to trade, there was a slight increase in inequality that is probably associated to the way in which we open up to trade with the United States particularly. So lesson 5 is that there might be some unexpected effects. So if you open up to trade and you think that everything is going to be good, well, it depends. For example, what happened to with Mexico and the United States is that Mexico's economy is relatively small compared to the United States. And that means that by integrating, we now move as the US moves. We now depend a lot on what happens with the US. And to show you that, just see what the industrial activity indexes in Mexico and the United States in the past 30 years, you can see